You've been looking through the data, and you see a little bit of what you called funkiness in the South African data. Why don't you explain that? Because this could be pretty important.
Yeah, well, the key question is whether or not this escapes immunity and whether or not that escape is contributing to its perceived rapid spread. I think that's going to be the key question to nail down, and whether or not the vaccines are protective and whether or not the immunity offered by prior infection with Delta is going to be protective, because that's going to give us a window into how big the risk is here in the United States. But when you look at the data from South Africa, there's a presumption that this just came on the scene very recently. In fact, I think the South Africans are going to update some of the analysis and say that maybe this first emerged in early November. Right now, the presumption is this first emerged in early October. But there's a possibility when you look at the data and the sequences that they put into the databases that they oversampled an initial early cluster. It appears that a lot of those sequences came from one university cluster. And so they're seeing less genetic diversity in some of those early sequences than what you would normally see if you had a more diverse set of patients. And so they're presuming that this is very new, when in fact this might have been circulating for quite some time. If it has been circulating for a longer period of time, what that would suggest is it's probably far more pervasive than what we perceive right now, and it's already broken out. But it also suggests that maybe this was circulating against the backdrop of declining symptomatic cases overall in South Africa and declining hospitalizations. Remember, the best data point we have, sadly, right now is unfortunately that plane that went into Amsterdam, with 13 of the 61 cases were this new variant. The other 48 were presumed to be Delta. When you look at the sequencing that South Africa was doing up until this point, they started to have a big spike in Delta cases, and then they completely switched over to sequencing cases with the so-called S gene dropout on PCR. So the sequencing started to be biased towards this new variant, and so they're no longer sequencing other cases right now, which is understandable. But there is a Delta surge going on in the backdrop of the spread of this variant. So we don't know if some of the recent uptick that we're seeing in South Africa is also Delta. On the plane, 20% of the cases were this new variant. The others were presumed to be Delta. Is that the prevalence of Delta versus Omicron overall in South Africa? We just don't know at this point. And one final point. On November 23rd, they started to include positive antigen tests in their daily total of cases. So people were looking Friday and Thursday at the big spike in cases being reported in South Africa and were presuming that it was all this new variant. What was happening was they were starting to bake into their daily totals positive antigen tests. And that was unfortunately timed that they started doing that on November 23rd. But that is also part of what we're seeing in the reports coming out of South Africa. This is really my final point. I think what's giving people pause is that when they're going and looking at the PCR tests and looking for S gene dropout, they're seeing a lot of it, and that's giving them the sense that there's a lot of this virus circulating in South Africa. And that indeed may be true. But the question is, when did it start to circulate? Did it start in early November, or has this been circulating for 2 or 3 months, which is a distinct possibility, in which case it's already here in the United States, and we're going to start to find it this week.
Scott, I think maybe the most hopeful thing I've heard coming out of this is that the symptoms are milder than what we've seen in the past from some of the other variants. At least that's the early word from some of the doctors who are dealing with these patients on the front line. Can we take solace in that? Can we hang our hat on it?
I think we need to understand how prevalent it is. If we determine this week, and I think we'll get to the bottom of this week in the epidemiology, if we determine that this is highly prevalent in South Africa, but they really haven't seen a big spike in hospitalizations and symptomatic cases, then that might be reassuring at a high level. There is an uptick in hospitalizations in the province where this is being identified. But again, I think that they're experiencing a surge in Delta infection as well. They had a rapid decline in Delta. They reopened. They lifted a lot of their mitigation. And I think, like the UK, they're seeing an uptick in Delta infections. That's certainly what they were seeing right up until the point where they started to bias sequencing towards S gene dropout samples, which are going to be this Omicron variant.
Scott, wanted to understand the distinction between the vaccines that we have, and I know we'll be talking to Albert Bourla in just a moment, but the therapeutics that are coming out in terms of these pills and how you think that they will work or not work in the future.
Well, look, the therapeutics, the orally available drugs, shouldn't be affected by this variant, given the mechanism of action. Of the antibody drugs on the market, based on just some preliminary testing, what's been disclosed, it appears that the AstraZeneca and the Vir biotechnology antibodies shouldn't be affected as well. There's some question around the Regeneron and the Lilly antibodies, but both companies are working on second-generation and third-generation drugs and can move those to the market very quickly. So I don't think that we're going to lose our therapeutics. The two key questions in my mind are how protective is a vaccine going to be? There's a reasonable degree of confidence in vaccine circles that at least 3 doses of fully boosted patient is going to have fairly good protection against this variant. And then the other critical question, I think this is just as critical, is how protective is prior infection with Delta. If we're seeing that prior infection with Delta isn't conferring any meaningful protection here, that's going to be concerning, and that's going to tip more in favor of the fact that this could potentially start to spread here in the United States. But we have a pretty good toolbox. Final point, it looks like the antigen tests, the major antigen tests that are on the market based on epitope mapping right now, it looks like they will be sensitive at detecting this new variant.